Hello and welcome back to the channel, and in this video I want to talk about universal basic income. And the reason that this has been triggered is because UK news have been full of two pilot schemes in the UK where they're going to be trialling universal basic income with around about 30 or so volunteers. Now there's a lot of misunderstanding of what universal basic income is and how it works. And so there's been a lot of sort of noise about it, quite a lot of it not necessarily accurate. Now I have a particular interest in this topic. I've been interested in it for a while because it has quite interesting political implications and because I'm also a student of economics. But I must stress that I am not highly qualified to talk on this subject. I'm just someone with some qualifications and lots of interest. So do treat everything I say as opinion on this matter. But the purpose of this video, I think, is to try and be helpful and explain to people why UBI as a concept will generate quite a lot of political noise and some of the implications that it has for any nation and the politicians of those nations that wish to adopt it. So, without further ado, let's dive right into it. So I'll start with a bit of an explainer in case people perhaps aren't very familiar with this concept of what is universal basic income, also abbreviated to UBI. Well, the concept in a nutshell is actually very simple. It is that literally every single citizen or adult in a country, possibly within a certain age range, so for example working age, or you might just decide to make it applicable to everybody, the variations on the theme. But the concept is that every single person, stroke adult, in that country gets paid a basic income by the government. And it's universal and it's a no questions asked benefit. So it's literally, you live there, you're a citizen, you're born there, whatever it may be, and you get a certain amount of money from the government every single month, every single year. Now in the UK trial, they picked 30 volunteers and they have chosen to give those volunteers £1,600 British for a period of 2 years. That amounts to about £20,000 a year. Now admittedly, this is a bit higher than what most UBI proponents would propose. They would normally go for something a bit lower than that. But this is an academic study, and what they have gone for is what they call the national living wage. And what they're trying to assess is what impact does UBI have on those individuals? What will they do with the money? How will it change their lives? Now, just to clarify as well, because this is another concept worth just understanding, basic income is a little bit different to UBI. Basic income is a bit more means tested. And effectively, that is, it will cover people who are not earning that income. The government will give them that income to a specified amount. And again, a sort of no questions asked type policy. So a lot of UK benefits tend to be quite means tested, tend to be intrusive, there's questionnaires. The whole process is not designed to be easy and it carries quite a considerable administrative burden. So one of the arguments about things like universal basic income is that there is hardly any administrative burden. It's extremely simple. You just pay everybody a certain income and that's it. You literally put the money straight into their account and you don't really track what they're doing with that money. So that is the concept of universal income, basic income. And it's been a concept that's been doing around for quite a while. A lot of people are really interested in it because they're trying to figure out whether this is a really good means of replacing all existing welfare payments in an economy and the sort of impacts that this will have on the individual and the economy. Now I'll come back to the economy bit in a moment. But in terms of impact to the individual, There have been other similar-ish trials done in Finland and in California. And what they found is that by paying those recipients sort of these kind of benefits, it took a lot of stress away from them. So if they needed to do things like improve their health or do some studying or so on whilst hunting for a job, then it made their lives that little bit better, reduced their stress. Now the argument goes here is that by doing that you actually cut other costs to the state. For example, less mental health needs maybe, less other health concerns and so on and so forth. So maybe even less crime, who knows. So that's kind of the idea of UBI. It's meant to have that impact, and what the point of these pilots is to see how people will react. But what it won't do is measure the impact on the economy, and I'm going to turn to that next. So I have thought up some questions that are pretty much uppermost in my mind when talking about UBI. And now the issue with this pilot that's happening in the UK is it is too small scale to make any kind of valid conclusions on economic impact. And really those studies are not designed to do that. They're designed to measure the impact on the individuals, not the wider sort of economy and so on. Now for me, that's, I find that very limited personally. My opinion on that is we already know what a lot of the impact is on the individuals, but we don't know what the impact could be on the economy. And those are where the biggest objections to concepts such as UBI tend to lie. So to test that, you need to do a really big pilot. You need to find a whole wide area, and you need to put everybody in that area under some form of UBI, and then over a period of time you measure the impact it has on the local economy, on prices, and so on and so forth. But having said all that, these are the particular questions that I think anyone who's arguing for or against UBI should really be asking, should really be focused on. So the first one is that what impact will this have on inflation? And many economists talk about this. Now in this day and age, we all know what inflation looks like. It's on the news all the time. We can see what a devastating impact it has on economies and on personal finances, particularly for people who are not especially well paid. So the argument kind of goes that UBI takes that away. After all, you almost eliminate poverty because everybody, unless you spend the money in very silly ways, you can't be ridiculously poor. So the idea behind UBI is you set it to a level that allows people to meet their bills, to meet their housing costs, to buy some food, to maybe some clothes, and be able to get to job interviews and that sort of thing. It is not necessarily the idea that they can live off UBI itself comfortably. But having said all that, there is still the potential for impact. You're still giving people more disposable income. And as economists will say, when there is more money available, then that can lead to more demand, and more demand leads to higher prices / inflation. So one of the particular risks of rolling out UBI on a national basis is that it could have potentially an impact on the inflation of that economy. Now, whether that impact is temporary, as it's being rolled out, or becomes permanent is not really known. But that is, for me, one of the first questions that people should want to ask about UBI. The second question to ask is, what is the possible impact on wages? Now, maybe this is logical, maybe it isn't. But if everybody's been paid UBI, does that mean that wages will go down because employers will take UBI into account and drive wages down? So wage suppression, in other words. Or does it perhaps mean the opposite? Does it mean that people have enough to live, they are thus less desperate, and as a consequence of that, It is the employee that has more bargaining power when negotiating salaries with potential employers. It can go either way on this argument, and I've not currently seen any particular good trial or analysis that evidence which way it goes. Unfortunately, the UK pilot will not test it, but that is one of the really interesting questions to ask, is the impact that it could have on wages. And the third question I have is, what impact could UBI have on the national economy? So let's think about it in terms of the UK trial, in that those individuals will be receiving £20,000 a year. Now, unless they have a fairly expensive lifestyle, they can presumably cover all their costs on that money, possibly enough left over for a certain amount of luxuries. So will they go out and work? That is a question. That is the question the media have been asking. And there's no real evidence on this as of yet. And this is one of the things that people really want to try and understand. Because there is the obvious argument that people will sit at home and do nothing, enjoy life, and so on and so forth. But there's also the counter argument that you take a certain level of stress and pressure away from people's lives. But people are social animals. They want to go out and do things. They want to interact with other humans. So this does not necessarily mean they won't work, but it might mean that they then become much fussier about where they work and who they work for. So work at this point becomes a bit more of an option, and so people would choose to work in order to pay for luxuries, nice cars and holidays and things like that. They won't be desperate to work because otherwise they'll starve and become homeless. Now, on a sort of social and moral sort of perspective, that has a certain argument. But what economists really want to understand, and they're going to struggle very much to accurately model this in any meaningful way without a full-blown trial, is what impact did people changing their attitude to work have on the whole of economic productivity. Now, many people who don't think much about this topic will instantly think it will go down. But actually, there's no real evidence for that. It might go the other way. People might choose to become more productive because they do things that they enjoy doing. They do things that they want to do. And people who do things that they want to do tend to be more enthusiastic about it. So if there was a national culture that you still went out and did things, even if you weren't so desperate, you could be more affordable, more picky, then that may actually lead to economic productivity increasing. On the other hand, by contrast, people may really decide they're not going to do those horrible jobs, and those horrible jobs may actually be what is essential for making the economy tick, for allowing the economy to be productive. Maybe you can look at social care, maybe you can look at picking fruit in farms and so on, as jobs that people would instantly not want to do if they're receiving UBI. And so that might lead to an economic decline, although some economists do argue that what that actually would lead to is increased capitalisation, because then farmers or employers or so on would have to find ways of automating the process of using machines and so on to do the jobs that otherwise you could give to very cheap people. And the final thing that I want to talk about in this section, which is not something that many people talk about, and particularly not economists, but this is my personal thing, is what is the political impact of UBI? Specifically, how can you stop politicians from abusing it? And this is one of the concerns I would have with UBI, because when the state dictates how much income everybody has, then that gives politicians a lot of power to make a really direct impact on people's lives. Now, they do now already. You can argue that they do that through minimum wage legislation, employment rights, and so on. But this is a little bit more direct. And it is not inconceivable to imagine that politicians will use UBI payments in a way to either bribe or coerce the electorate into reacting in certain ways. So, vote for me and I will increase UBI if, at the next after the next election, sort of promise. And this is one of the interesting questions, because no one really knows, as far as I'm aware, what is the correct level of UBI. Set it too low and possibly it's not particularly effective. Set it too high and it might actually damage national productivity. It might cause economic harm. We just don't know. But we certainly know that that is probably something you can't trust politicians not to mess around with. So one of the parallel questions I'd always have with using something like UBI is, how can you protect it from unscrupulous politicians who want to use it for their own ends? So now we come to the most important question of all. Will UBI actually work? But the honest answer, I don't think anyone can give an answer to this. I don't think anyone really knows. There's not been a proper trial to prove it. And I think anyone who strongly argues for or against it is basically projecting their own opinion rather than anything based on evidence or fact. Even economists will try and model it, but those models are notorious for being somewhat inaccurate on occasion. So truthfully, I don't think anyone knows. And I think what I have seen though, what you can be sure of, is that people will do all sorts of, express various silly opinions and ask silly questions. And I've seen that particularly done by the journalists recently against this pilot. For starters, they have projected this onto the national level. And really, it doesn't take too much digging into the details of the trials to understand that they are not intended to be used at a national level. They're answering specific questions. The idea is not for everybody in the whole country to be paid £20,000 a year, for example. They just want to know what does happen when you pay someone £20,000 a year. So it's not that accurate a trial in that sense. The other really glaring inaccuracy to be aware of is, for example, when the journalists tried to calculate what the tax bill would be to the UK government. And apart from the fact that 20,000 is not any kind of agreed figure, so you can't project that, what a lot of the journalists have been guilty of doing is ignoring a lot of the other costs. So, for example, the whole point of UBI is that you wouldn't have to pay people unemployment benefits. You wouldn't have to pay them housing benefits. You wouldn't have to pay them a whole host of other benefits. All of that could be scrapped. In fact, you could even scrap the whole of the state pension system if you decide that all pensioners should also receive UBI. And that alone, don't know what the exact figure is, but in the UK, I think that might be close to about £100 billion a year. It's a very expensive welfare pensions. All nations having to juggle with it. So whenever you're trying to calculate the cost of UBI to any government that wants to use it, you have to deduct the welfare cost from that total. And there's a whole host of other factors that can come into play here as well. Let me perhaps go a little bit broader in some of the other elements of economic thinking linked to UBI. So one of the ideas, for example, is, and this is an academic idea, again it's not proven, but that you could give everybody in an economy UBI. You could then remove things like minimum wage limit legislation, and you can make it much easier to hire and to fire people in any given economy. Now I know what some people might think. They might have an automatic reaction of that would be a horrible place to live, sort of thing, and the employers could be really unpleasant to their employee. But actually, don't be too fast to jump to judgment here, because strangely enough, there's an argument that doing it this way would actually benefit those at the lower end of the pay spectrum more than the higher end. So if we assume, for example, everyone's been paid £20,000 a year, then people would work because they chose to work. And the thing is, they could mix and match that as well. So because they're not desperate. So someone could, for example, decide that they're going to work in a charity shop for £2 an hour. Why? Because they believe in the cause of that charity. And they perhaps don't want to offer their time for free, but they're certainly willing to accept a lower pay in order to do nicer or things, nicer things or things they're more interested in. That same afternoon or week, they could then go and work in Tesco and charge £10 an hour. There is that complete element of flexibility. And if Tesco gets really nasty with them and just fires them, well, that doesn't matter too much because they've got UBI to fall back on and they'll just go and find somewhere else to work. By contrast, if you're a very expensive banker, paid considerably more than what UBI is offering, then you have more to lose. Because as a banker, you're going to have more expensive tastes, you have more expensive mortgages, nicer cars. But if the same economic factors are that if you do a bad job, the employer can fire you extremely easily, then this is a weird sort of dynamic where those at the lower end of the pay spectrum are actually in a better position than those at the higher end, because losing the job does not have the same impact on them, unless of course they've been spending way too much on luxuries, which they should be able to cut down, but that would have a more disproportionate impact on those at the higher end of the spectrum. And so the academic argument goes, it's not only are you treating everyone more fairly, but you're also enabling the wider economy to more accurately and more fairly punish those who are paid more but don't actually achieve the correct levels of performance. Now this is an academic level of thinking. It's never been trialed in the real world. But it is an interesting concept, and it underlines the fact that UBI in isolation, it can't be everything. It doesn't solve everything. So any nation that implements UBI would have to do a whole host of things around it, a whole host of changes that is very hard to understand the impact of until somebody really sits down and tries to actually do it and then implement it in a real world setting. So that is the cautionary note I would add when anyone's offering any opinions of UBI. If there's a lot of variables that go into it, and at this stage it's very hard for anyone to draw firm and evidence-based conclusions. So my final thoughts on this is that I am glad that they are doing these trials in the UK. I'm not entirely convinced the trial will tell us as much as we would like to know, but it is important that concepts such as universal basic income and basic income are trialled, are tested, and evidence is gathered to try and understand the impact that they can have on individuals and the wider economy as a whole. Because the truth is with these things is that there are quite significant risks, and there's some huge potential rewards as well. But no one knows what the economic impact will be, and it might not even be a one-size-fits-all thing either. What might work in one country may not work in another, possibly due to cultural differences. But you don't know until you test and trial it. And so whilst there's considerable potential economic downside, which is why politicians are so scared to try and actually properly implement UBI. They're scared of the unknown, and of course it's a big risk to them if it all goes wrong. But on the flip side, it's one of those things that can hugely change an economy. Will it change an economy for the better? Well, who knows? That's why we need a trial. But as a concept, I think they're interesting. I'm following this with close interest, and I hope that perhaps at the end of the 2 years of this study, there may be some interesting conclusions that can be drawn from it. So I hope you found this video interesting. I personally consider this to be an interesting topic. I hope people who follow the channel share that view. I absolutely would welcome any other insights that people might offer on UBI, including any particular deep analysis that, on modelling or pitfalls and things to follow, to avoid. Because I think this is an interesting debate, and it is not a debate that is going away. It is getting louder and louder in lots of countries, with lots of people who are really curious to explore, could this work? And I think it's about time we started to get answers to those questions. So thank you very much for listening. Please do like and subscribe if you like this comment, and absolutely please do comment with any interesting insights you might have into UBI.